Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a case that's become, well, pretty infamous for its tangled web of details and just all these lingering mysteries. It's the deaths of Nicole Olson and her daughters, Alexa and Lyndon, at their home in Anaqua Springs Ranch. It was back in 2019.
Yeah, this is one of those cases that really, I think, highlights the challenge of separating fact from speculation, especially when you've got a setting like this. I mean, this affluent, gated community, you really wouldn't expect something this horrific to happen in a place that projects an image of, well, safety and security.
Yeah, you're right. It's that contrast that I think makes this case so intriguing. On the surface, the initial reports pointed towards a murder-suicide. Right. Tragic. But as you dig deeper, you find all these nagging inconsistencies, things that just don't sit right.
Absolutely. And that's really what we're here to do today. We're going to pack it all. We've got a stack of articles, some court documents, even some analysis from forensic experts. So we're going to try to make sense of it all.
All right. Well, let's start by setting the scene. It's January 10th, 2019. A 911 call comes in from Nicole's boyfriend, Charlie Wheeler. He says he's found Nicole and her daughters dead in their home.
And right away, there's something a little bit off about the situation. The responding officer, he notes that while Charlie appears to be crying, there aren't any visible tears. That detail, small as it may seem, it becomes one of many that casts doubt on that, straightforward story that initially emerges.
Inside the house, well, it's a pretty horrific scene. There's blood, gunshot wounds, and a gun is found near Nicole's body. It all seems to point towards that tragic scenario that Charlie described, right? A mother who took her daughter's lives and then her own.
But here's where things get interesting. Remember, this was a gated community, considered very safe. So the idea of an intruder, or someone else being involved, it seemed unlikely at first. But then as the investigation unfolds, we get more and more details emerging that complicate the whole picture.
Like the fact that Nicole had been making plans for the future. She'd canceled her usual salon appointments, but then she scheduled 2 new ones for the very morning she was found dead. And she'd also been emailing with an apartment complex, possibly, looking for a new place to live.
Yeah, those actions, those are really difficult to square with the idea that she was planning to take her own life, let alone, the lives of her daughters. It suggests she was looking ahead, like trying to create a different future for herself and for her girls.
Right. And then there are the accounts from Nicole's friends. They describe Charlie as being, controlling, jealous. They even recall instances where he exhibited aggressive behavior. One friend even remembers seeing Nicole with a black eye.
Yeah, this is where those testimonies, they start to introduce the possibility of domestic abuse. Within the relationship, it's something that the initial investigation seemed to just overlook entirely. It raises the question, could this have been a case of a woman, driven to this desperate act by an abusive partner rather than, some premeditated act of violence against her children?
So we've got this seemingly straightforward murder-suicide, but we've also got these conflicting details about Nicole's state of mind and the nature of her relationship with Charlie. And then, to make things even more complicated, the autopsy results come in.
Right. While Alexa and Lyndon's deaths are definitively ruled homicides, the medical examiner determines that Nicole's death was a suicide.
Which, on the surface, seems to support that initial theory. But I'm sure you'll explain, even that ruling isn't as clear-cut as it might appear.
You got it. It really isn't. See, a medical examiner's report, it focuses solely on the physical evidence, the gunshot wound, position of the gun, all that. It doesn't take into account the psychological complexities, the potential for coercion, or even just the broader context of the relationship. It can't.
Right. And to complicate things even further, despite the suicide ruling, the Bexar County Sheriff, he insists that the investigation remains open.
And that right there, that's unusual. It suggests that even with the medical examiner's findings, the sheriff and his team, they weren't totally convinced that they had the full story. Like, they sensed there were still pieces missing, things that just didn't add up.
And they weren't the only ones. Alexa and London's families, they were and still are adamant that Nicole would never, ever harm her daughters. They describe her as a devoted mother, completely dedicated to her girls.
In their perspective, I think that adds a really crucial layer to this whole story. They knew Nicole, intimately. And their belief in her innocence, it challenges that official narrative and forces us to really question, well, what do we think we know? It also highlights the limitations of just relying solely on forensic evidence, without considering those personal testimonies, the victim's history, all of that.
Okay, so we've got this tangled web of conflicting information, a seemingly straightforward suicide ruling that leaves a lot of questions unanswered, and then families who just refuse to believe that their loved one could have been capable of such a horrific act. And then, just when you think it can't get any more complicated, a series of bombshells drop that completely change the trajectory of the case.
The first of these bombshells comes in the form of some newly uncovered text messages. Turns out Alexa's phone was potentially used to communicate with Charlie just hours before the death.
Wait, so someone was using Alexa's phone to text with Charlie on the very night she died. What were they talking about?
That's the million-dollar question. One text message from Charlie, he even expresses concern about Nicole's behavior, saying, "I left your mom making me worried."
Okay, so this puts Charlie directly in contact with someone in the house, just hours before everyone is found dead. What does this mean for his alibi, the one where he claimed to be staying at a relative's house?
It definitely raises some questions about his whereabouts, right?
Yeah.
And his awareness of what was happening at Nicole's house that night. And remember, this is just the first of several major revelations that come to light.
All right, so we've got this seemingly straightforward murder-suicide that's quickly unraveling, conflicting accounts from those who knew Nicole, and now text messages that place Charlie in communication with someone at the house on the night of the deaths. What else is there?
Well, this is where it gets really chilling. Remember those inconsistencies that the sheriff's department seemed to be picking up on? Turns out Nicole made not one, but 4 911 calls on the night she died.
4. That's terrifying. Did anyone answer? What happened during those calls?
Only one of those calls actually connected, and it was disconnected really quickly. The operator tried to call back, but they couldn't reestablish contact.
So potentially 4 cries for help and only one even briefly connected. This completely changes our understanding of what might have been happening in that house. What were those calls about? Was Nicole trying to report abuse? Was she trying to protect her daughters?
These unanswered 911 calls, they really become a central focus of the whole investigation. And a source of immense frustration for the families and for the public. They represent this missed opportunity, a potential intervention that could have changed everything.
So we've gone from a seemingly open and shut case to this tangled web of unanswered questions, conflicting accounts, and missed opportunities. And it's only going to get more complex from here.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll dive into the fallout from these revelations, the evolving role of Charlie Wheeler in the investigation and the emergence of new theories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the Anaqua Springs Ranch case. Man, those 911 calls, they really shift the focus of this whole thing. They introduce this sense of urgency, like something was really wrong in that house that night.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to think about, if those calls had been answered, could things have been different? Could Nicole and her daughters have been saved?
Well, it's impossible to say for sure, but it's definitely a question that I think continues to haunt everyone involved in this case, Those unanswered calls, they just become this symbol of missed opportunities and maybe even systemic failures.
And remember, these revelations about the text messages and the 911 calls, this all comes at a time when public scrutiny of the investigation is already intensifying, right?
Yeah.
And that lack of transparency from the sheriff's department, that's not helping. It's fueling a lot of speculation and distrust.
People want answers. That's natural, and they're not getting them. The families of Alexa in London, they're demanding more information. And the media, well, they're starting to dig a little deeper into the inconsistencies, and all those unanswered questions surrounding the case.
And it's right in this climate of heightened scrutiny that the investigation takes another dramatic turn. Remember, Charlie Wheeler, Nicole's boyfriend, he's officially designated as a person of interest in the case.
Huge development. It means that while he's not officially a suspect, investigators believe he may have information, relevant to the case, or that his potential involvement, hasn't been completely ruled out.
But remember, the sheriff had said before that Charlie was cooperating with the investigation. So why publicly label him a person of interest, if he's being helpful? It seems a little counterintuitive.
It does. And that discrepancy, I think that just adds to all the confusion and suspicion surrounding the case. It suggests that despite his cooperation, there are things about his story, maybe his behavior, that just aren't sitting right with investigators.
So then we're left wondering, what is it about Charlie that's making investigators uneasy? Could it be, something simple like inconsistencies in his alibi? Or could it be something, something more sinister?
It's really hard to say for sure. We don't have access to all the details of the investigation. But the fact that they went public with this, naming him as a person of interest, well, it suggests they believe he holds a key piece of the puzzle.
And this announcement about Charlie, it comes just as another major player enters the scene, the FBI.
That's right. They join the investigation and they bring with them all these additional resources and expertise. Their involvement really raises the stakes, you know? It suggests this case might be more complex than anyone initially thought.
So what exactly does the FBI's involvement mean? Does it mean they suspect it's something more than a simple murder-suicide?
It could. They often get involved in cases that cross state lines, maybe involve complex financial transactions, or suggest a wider conspiracy, you know? Maybe even organized crime.
The sheriff even suggested at one point that the deaths could be the work of a stranger.
Yeah, but that theory never really took off. There's no evidence of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, and really nothing to suggest that anyone other than Nicole and Charlie were at the house that night.
But even the fact that he mentioned it at all, even briefly,
What happened?
well, it kind of contradicts that initial idea of a simple murder-suicide, doesn't it? It's like they're just throwing out every possible scenario.
Almost like they're acknowledging that they don't really have a clear picture of what happened. You know, like there are gaps in their understanding and they're open to anything, even if it seems unlikely.
But even with this openness to new theories, the sheriff's department remains tight-lipped about the details of the investigation. Weeks turn into months, and the families of Alexa and London are left in the dark, desperate for answers.
Yeah, the lack of transparency is a big theme in this case. It only adds to the frustration and all the suspicion. The families, they feel like they're being shut out, and the public is just left to speculate, what's really going on.
Yeah. It's almost as if they think by withholding information, they're protecting the investigation. But really, it's doing the opposite. It's just breeding more distrust and fueling those conspiracy theories.
And it's not just the lack of communication that's concerning. There are questions about how thorough the investigation actually was,
Like, what about geofencing? Did they look into that?
It's like how your phone knows when you're near a store and sends you a coupon, right? Well, investigators can use that same technology, geofencing, to see if any unknown fans were near the house that night. It could show someone was there who hasn't come forward, someone who was never even on their radar.
Wow, that's fascinating. It seems like that would have been a really valuable tool, especially since there weren't any other leads pointing to someone else.
Exactly. And there's an organization, Project Absentis. They specialize in helping families navigate these really complex investigations. They actually suggested using geofencing in this case.
But did the sheriff's department actually do it?
Well, that's the problem. We don't know. They never publicly said whether they did or didn't use it. So again, more lack of transparency, more questions about whether they were thorough enough.
So we're left with all these questions. Did they really explore every avenue? Did they miss potential evidence? Did they focus on Nicole and Charlie too quickly? Maybe missing other important clues.
It's frustrating, right? Not knowing what they did or didn't do. It makes you wonder if we'll ever know the truth about that night in Anaqua Springs Ranch.
But even though the official investigation seemed to stall, the families of Alexa and London, they didn't give up. They're determined to find answers and hold someone accountable for what happened to their loved ones.
I mean, their determination is incredible. So many roadblocks, so much silence, so much evasion, and they just keep pushing for the truth. They're not just fighting for their own families, they're fighting for all families who haven't gotten justice.
And their fight leads to another twist. Years after Nicole, Alexa, and London's deaths, both fathers file lawsuits against Charlie Wheeler.
Yeah, big development. It shows the families believe they have enough evidence, even though there were no criminal charges, to hold Charlie responsible for the girls' deaths.
And those lawsuits, they're largely based on what's been leaked about those text messages from Alexa's phone and all the details from Nicole's 911 calls.
Remember, that stuff was never officially released. It was all leaked. Which makes you think someone involved in the case felt that information needed to get out. Like maybe it wasn't being taken seriously enough.
So the families are saying Charlie knew, or should have known, that Nicole and her daughters were in danger, and he didn't do anything.
Yeah, like he knew it was a volatile situation, maybe even an abusive one, and by not doing anything, he contributed to the tragedy.
That's a pretty complex legal argument. It could take years to play out in court, but it shows just how committed the families are to getting justice for their daughters, even if it means going outside the normal system.
It really shows how much they loved their kids. They haven't given up on the truth, no matter how hard it is to find.
So we're left with this mess of evidence, conflicting stories, missed opportunities, and so many unanswered questions. The Anaqua Springs Ranch case, it's become this symbol of how hard it is to get justice sometimes. Like the system is more concerned with being quick than being thorough, and more concerned with keeping things quiet than being open.
Yeah, it raises some uncomfortable questions about domestic violence, about how well our emergency services respond, and whether people in power are really held accountable.
And while we may never know exactly what happened that night, the fight for answers, the fight for justice, the love these families have, it reminds us that even after something terrible happens, the human spirit is strong. People can keep going and searching for meaning.
We'll be right back to finish up our deep dive into the Anaqua Springs Ranch case. We'll talk about some possible scenarios and take a closer look at the people involved.
So where does this all leave us? We've got these mysteries hanging over everything and evidence that doesn't quite line up. How do we make sense of it?
It's tough, right? Like a puzzle with missing pieces and some that just don't seem to belong. We've got to look at everything, every angle, and really weigh the evidence. Okay, so let's start with what the official ruling says. Murder-suicide. If we accept that Nicole killed her daughters and then herself, well, that brings up some really heavy questions.
Yeah. The biggest one for me is why? What would drive a mother to do that? Was it like a sudden break, overwhelming despair, or something more planned out,
And how does that fit with the stuff that shows she was making plans, the apartment hunting, the salon appointments? And that's not someone who's given up, is it?
Exactly. That's where the idea of someone pushing her or manipulating her comes in. Could someone else have made her do those things through threats or pressure?
Which brings us back to Charlie. Even if we say Nicole was suicidal, could he have made her that way? By what he did or didn't do?
Chilling thought, but we can't rule it out. If there was abuse, control, that kind of thing, maybe Nicole felt completely trapped. And those 911 calls, man, if that's true, it makes them even more tragic. Was she trying to get help, trying to get away from a bad situation?
It's a possibility that really stays with you. Those calls not being answered. It's a symbol of what happens when we don't see the signs of abuse, or don't act on them.
But let's flip it for a second. What if Nicole didn't kill herself? What if that ruling's not the whole story?
Whoa, okay. That opens up a whole other set of possibilities. If not Nicole, then who? And why the girls?
The most obvious answer at first glance is Charlie. Could he have been more involved than he says? Could those texts from Alexa's phone be more than what we know?
Right. We have to keep in mind we only know what's been leaked about those texts. The official content. Never released. So there could be more to it.
Even if those messages don't show anything bad, there's still his alibi. Was he really where he said he was? Could there be holes in his story?
And again, the lack of transparency from the authorities makes it hard to say. Did they really check out his alibi, talk to witnesses, find other proof?
And then there's that outside chance that it wasn't either of them. Could someone else have gotten into the house? Is there a motive we haven't even thought of?
You mentioned geofencing before. If they'd used that, they might have found other phones near the house that night.
But we don't know if they ever did, right? That's the thing. It's that lack of knowing on top of everything else that makes this so frustrating.
It feels like there's vital info missing, things that could change everything about how we see this.
So, after going through all this, where do we land? Was it a mother pushed too far by someone who hurt her? Was Charlie more involved? Or, is there another answer? Someone else in this story we've missed entirely.
The Anaqua Springs case. It really shows how hard truth can be to find. Even with all our fancy forensics and investigation, some mysteries just stay mysteries.
But it also shows us the human cost of those mysteries. The families left behind, dealing with the pain and all these unanswered questions. Their fight for justice, for the truth, it's inspiring. It shows how powerful love is and how important it is to never give up hope, even when things seem impossible.
So as you keep thinking about this case, ask yourself, what sticks with you? What parts jump out? What would you want to ask if you could talk to the investigators? This case, even with all the mystery, it makes us think, question what we assume, and never stop looking for answers. That's what it's about.